Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding, and you are once again listening to PreserveCast. Excited today to be sitting down and having a conversation about architecture from a different angle. We're going to be sitting down and talking with David Lopez, who has 25 years of experience as a builder, a designer, a fabricator, a teacher. He's been in Hawaii, he's been in Seattle, Washington, and for our purposes, he's been here in Baltimore. And he has a great deal of interest in construction and making sure that projects meet their aesthetic intentions. But for our purposes, he's been involved heavily in reimagining historic places and oftentimes reimagining them as breweries. And that's a whole different skill set and like different sort of needs that come about as a result of those types of projects. So before we get to those, though, we love to get to know our guests. So, David, tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what led to your interest in this type of work.
I grew up here in Baltimore, Maryland, originally born and raised. Lived here, my family's lived here my whole life. I did go out west for graduate school to Seattle, wound up hanging out there for the better part of a decade, and then moved to Hawaii for an opportunity. Stayed there for about 2 years. Once that opportunity had run its course, I kind of went back to Seattle briefly. And then as my sister started having more and more kids, family called me back to the East Coast. So I worked my way back here right around 2005 and came back and started working for one of the larger firms in town. Sort of got a lot of my architecture experience through that firm and through my time there. After about 11 years at that firm in 2015, 10 years, I guess, I made the leap to become a sole proprietor and a sole practitioner, and left to join some other friends of mine who had a small, aggregate studio where a lot of people kind of operated as sole proprietors and did their own work, but we were collectively a little bit of a studio of 3 or 4 different firms. And the brewery side, the brewery projects kind of just fell into my lap. We had a client, one of the other architects in the office had a client that was trying to move to Baltimore. He had some trouble getting his brewery built and constructed in Montgomery County. He ran into a lot of red tape there and a lot of issues with the space that he was trying to lease, and somehow sort of fell into the idea of, well, I'll just take it up the road to Baltimore. He came in, met with one of the people I was sharing the office with. Their price point was too high. And since I was just starting out my business, my price point was a little bit lower. So I asked if I could talk to him. He said, sure, go ahead, take a stab at it. I wound up talking to him, and that project turned into Suspended Brewing Company, which later opened in Pigtown at a building that was kind of a warehouse building, but somebody had turned it into one of those transient type churches for a while. right there on Washington Boulevard. And then eventually we took over that space when the church had moved out. It had been vacant for a year or two. He moved his brewery equipment in, we set it up and got that brewery started.
So let me stop you for a second. Yeah, I mean, let's take a step back too, which is where did the interest in architecture come from? We can dig into the brewery piece, but talk to us about like growing up. Was it always architecture? Was it history, or where did you sort of first get the bug for that?
Yeah, good question. It's hard to like put a pin on it, I guess, but I would say, I've always had an interest in drawing and art and artistic things. My mother was pretty artistic, and sort of really appreciated kind of how she handled like drawing and various mediums. She did like a bang up job with Christmas decorations every year, and I got into helping her out with that. And sort of my interest in art and drawing and sketching and things grew from that. By the time I got to sixth or seventh grade, some reality hit me that artists don't really make any money, and I wanted to be sure to have a direction in life that had a career. And I fell into architecture, thinking that it would be a better way to make a living. As early as like seventh or eighth grade, I think I had that thought originally. So by the time I got to high school, I had an interest in pursuing it. Um, you know, and that's where it kind of started. I think I took some drafting classes in high school. I went to Mount St. Joseph High School here in Baltimore, Maryland, and they had CAD proficient classes. This was back in the 1990s, late 80s, early 90s, and so that's where it started. Like the technical drawing side of things, I really sort of gravitated towards it, and appreciated it. And then by the time I got to college, I was ready to go with that as a discipline. So it was always there, just kind of born from that relationship with my mother and sort of building drawing and sketching and sort of a love of art and artistic things. I guess
Yeah, it's interesting the different
I
ways
was going to
people
say, I
kind of
guess
get.
that in line with like I did have an appreciation for houses. So where my grandmother and grandfather lived was a pretty nice neighborhood, and there was a really cool kind of modernist house in the neighborhood that always caught my eye when we drove past it, and so I would spend a lot of time just thinking about that. So somehow those two things kind of intertwined to sort of churn my interest in architecture.
Yeah, I was gonna say like it's interesting how people kind of come to it in different ways. I'm curious if you kind of mentioned a modernist home. Is there a particular style of architecture that you gravitated towards? Because you end up working with a lot of historic resources. I'm curious if it's just kind of whatever comes in, or is there a certain type that you're sort of pulled towards?
Yeah. So to answer part of that question by going back to the previous answer, like eventually I landed on the realization as I got into the industry that architects don't make a lot of money. And so the net result of understanding that is I don't have in my current practice the ability to kind of pick and choose clients the way, say, some more well-known or well-established architecture firms would be able to. So we do take the work as it comes into the office. That allows me to work into a lot of different styles of architecture. So I wouldn't say I'm necessarily tied to any one particular style, but I've always had a very heavy interest in industrial architecture, and that was born. Like my thesis was written on grain elevators and kind of how they could be repurposed when I did my master's degree. So there was a kinship to me with America and American culture, if you will, sort of being born of the industrial age, and sort of seeing those two things sync up. Our history was starting to collect and become relevant and become noticeable. Like we're not a ancient Roman culture. We don't have 2,000 years of history like other countries do. So our history started to build up to a point where we could actually understand it a little bit at the same time the Industrial Revolution took off. And so that idea of man and machine working together, I don't know, has always kind of been important to me. And as a result, I think that industrial aesthetic of just form follows function is a key element in the work that I do, or at least I like to think it is, on every project that we take on. Obviously, some of the projects we take on, um, that 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 form follows function doesn't really matter as much. We're kind of just doing a row home rehabilitation or whatever. It doesn't really apply necessarily. But when we get into things like breweries or other project types, the need for that form follows function um, principle does still reign true in our work, I think, quite a bit. So that's kind of an aesthetic I think that I would say most interests me, and as a result of that, there's certain modernist architects that I think I've really grown to appreciate. People like Mies van der Rohe and um, Lou Kahn and Carlos Scarpa. These are architects that I think really did appreciate, that less is more kind of aesthetic, and the form follows function type of idealism, but did it in a very sort of sublime way that sort of married up to the cultural narratives from the places where they were engaged. So I really always liked that kind of work and those kind of architects.
Yeah, and that kind of makes sense for the work that you do with the breweries. Um, it's interesting as somebody who has gone to many a brewery. And obviously in this line of work, I look for places that are historic. But there's something special about a brewery in a historic building versus a strip mall, and like sometimes you can't put your finger on it, or people who don't work in the industry can't. What is it about historic spaces that lend themselves so well to breweries? I mean, there's certain things that um, do well in both kinds of spaces. You can create new housing, you can create adaptively reused housing, but there's something about the brewery or the winery or the distillery that seems to just sort of be purpose built for a historic space. What do you think it is about the spaces that lend themselves so well to it?
Great question. It's likely a very much a mixture of things. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that there is still a process to wineries, distilleries, breweries that is embedded in manufacturing and production of a product. So inherently, that process, the fact that something needs to be made or manufactured or developed from a grain, a fruit, a vine, whatever it is, and that it begins a process and then turns into, through fermentation and distillation, to a product that has value. That to me is in kinship with recognizing that each of these disciplines, whether you're a distiller, a brewer, or a winemaker, you are part of a historic timeline, and that you are crafting your beers or your wines or your liquors based on what previous people have done before you. So that lineage, I think, speaks well to historic spaces. And historic buildings, when you go in one, you would know this more than anyone. When you go in one, you just have this feeling of reverence and appreciation for time and what time can do to a building, and what a building can do to sort of reference a time. And so I think those two things marry up very well. The history of say the manufacturing and the making of beer, and it's important as a cultural staple, importance over time in various cultures as a staple. That speaks to those kind of historic spaces quite well. I think that's part of it. That's something I like to preach to my clients. I was like, when I'm working with one of my clients, I like to bring that up, that you're part of this long timeline. Let's put a little history into this, the feel of this space, so people feel like you've been brewing and you're part of that lineage. You're tied to the rest of the history. I think that makes the beer taste better. I think it just has a way of making you feel like you're connected to that past, and that you're not some guy or gal in the midst of a vacuum experimenting on your own and creating something that maybe doesn't have a lot of flavor, doesn't have a lot of ties to history, because you're just experimenting and putting something out. So I think that connection to that history is part of it. And then I think the other part is that alcohol historically has been something that people use to celebrate and to sort of relax and to sort of unwind and to sort of loosen their tongues, to have sort of a social appreciation for other people and sort of connect with other people. So that aspect of alcohol and its ability to create that circumstance for a lot of people, those spaces, those historic spaces, just because they've been around so long, just feel more comfortable to sit in than, like you sort of mentioned, the strip mall. Like, those spaces that have no character, that have no sort of feel to them, don't feel as comfortable to sit in as a historic space. So I think those two things aligned probably would be a good way to answer that question.
Yeah, and I feel like sometimes in new build architecture, they're trying to replicate some of those things, and they can convincingly do it sometimes, but it doesn't always come through perfectly.
That is true.
And I don't know what that is, but even somebody who's not an architectural historian somehow picks up on it.
Yeah, and not going to lie, we do some of that on some of our projects, just to try and build in that character. Suspended, that first brewery I mentioned, is part of that storyline. He had access to a bunch of reclaimed wood through a relative, and so wood is such a great material because it builds character. It sort of brings warmth into what otherwise would be cold spaces. So we took that wood and wrapped his cold box, his keg refrigerator, with the wood to sort of make it this volume within the space, and it became a very sort of warming element to the rest of the design. The rest of the building, kind of nondescript, to be totally honest. It was a theater in one of its past lives, so it had a really cool marquee when you come into the building. But after you got past that marquee and walked up to the bar, it was the wood that really called you and made you feel, there was some warmth to the space, because of the rest of the space was really, nondescript in a lot of ways. So it's taking advantage of those things. And to me, even though that wasn't necessarily us being in a historic building or historic space, the use of that historic material, the reclaimed wood that had come from some other building, and was used for some other purpose, and we're finding a way to reuse it, it brought some warmth, and it brought, for me at least, that dialogue of connecting to that history of brewery and brewing culture, to the project. So
yeah, and I feel like reclaimed lumber and reclaimed wood is probably the best case scenario that you can use. I was sort of referring to like LVP and stuff like that, with like a wood grain. You can kind of tell it isn't the real thing.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The reclaimed lumber certainly does the job. I'm curious, when you approach, I think you've really compellingly made the case that like there's value in connecting modern day brewing with historic, antecedents, or these historic trends, or just a historic space to kind of put yourself in context. Do we get is there good feedback? Is there good even just anecdotal data that like the average customer responds to that well? Like, do these places do well? Do you have examples that you've worked on of places that are sort of doing well, doing this in these spaces?
Yeah, for a while I had a pretty clean record on the breweries that we had done, and in general, all of our commercial clients. I didn't have a single restaurant, cafe, or brewery that had closed down. And to me, that's a sign of whether you did good design or bad design. It can be a sign, I should say.
Yeah, I was going to say it also could be a little bit of luck, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And so like location obviously is principally important.
Economy.
Yeah, all of that stuff. So, but before COVID, there were a lot of breweries that were opening and closing, and to me, if they were opening and closing within a year or two, it was typically a sign that they didn't invest properly in the space and the feel of their tap room.
Interesting.
Because they just didn't have that good connection mechanism to connect with people and share their product. They might have good beer. They might even have great labels on their cans. I don't know, but if you're not connecting to people through your tap room, you're not getting merchandise sold, T-shirts sold, so people can see the brand out there and about. Then you're putting yourself in a position to potentially fail. And so we made it a purpose with a lot of our brewers at the beginning to make sure that they were considering these type of things, and that a little bit of extra money, or what we would do is take money from other areas of the project and put towards their tap room to give it that feel and that vibe that makes people want to come there to have a beer or two, wants to come and bring the kids and meet up with a friend. We wanted those to become social spaces that people engaged. So the tap room was the number one face of the company and the brand. After that, it was the beer. That's the way I think of it. But I'm the architect, right? They're the brewer. They obviously think the beer is what sells, not the tap room. So it was always a dialogue with the brewer and trying to get to a point where we could both reach common ground on the best value for what they were trying to do.
Well, and I was going to jump in there and say that, like, one of the interesting things here is with like a beer or any product like this is that you can pick up a 6-pack and drink it anywhere, or you can go to a brewery. But with the brewery, and in the end, it's a, they might have different tastes, but it is the same product. It's really about the experience. And so, right, like that's what brings people there. Versus just buying it at the store, because in many of these cases, these breweries, you can buy it locally, you could buy it at a store and take it home. So the differentiator is the experience, and then at its core is the space, right? So it's like architecture drives this. I'm curious, when you say a lot of our brewers, give us a sense for how many of these you've done now.
So I have probably worked on about 20 different breweries and distilleries, maybe a little bit more than that. Of those, I would say a good half of them have been constructed or built out. I think I'm probably up to 12 or 13 breweries constructed. I have currently my first distillery client that I'm working with on various projects for a farm-based distillery. He's got a lot of buildings that he's putting money towards out there, and has already started, has already got a product line released. He's just now trying to build the environment to come and taste it. Yeah, I would say I'm probably in the mid-teens right now for projects built, but in terms of the number I've designed, it's over 20 for sure. Just not all of them have wound up getting constructed.
So you've kind of become like the go-to brewery architect of Maryland. Was that fair to say?
I don't know about that. I know there's a lot of firms that do them. I don't think a lot of firms do them well. I have gone in and taken over the finishing touches on one or two breweries from another architect. The brewer or the owners were just dissatisfied with the designs that they were being shown from the architect that got them a permit to do the construction, and then they asked me to do finishing touches. So I've done that on one or two projects. But I don't want to pat myself on the back too much. I would love to be called the brewery architect of Maryland, but that's high praise. I think there's a lot of other people that do good work out there that needs to be recognized as well. It's a design. It's a design project that I really appreciate doing for a number of reasons. One is everything we've already talked about, the history of beer making and brewery culture. I really love man and machine working together. I love the shiny tanks and the piping and everything that goes into it, and sort of exposing that process of manufacturing, making beer. And when you see it come out on tap, you can see visually the tanks that created it, and it just somehow tastes better when you feel it's that fresh. I really like that about the designs that we try and take on. The other side of it is just the people. I find brewers to be very appreciative of people who are patient enough to work with them and do good work and hold their hand through processes that they may not be so familiar with. These guys typically are these guys and gals are typically very much brewers, craft brewers by trade. Sometimes they're accountants in their real life, and they do beer making on the side, and their friends convince them, hey, let's put together some money and let's go make a brewery. Your beers are so good. And that's the typical client. First time they've ever done a build out, first time they've ever done an architecture project. And they're moving up from home brewing system to something that's more scaled towards manufacturing with a 5 or 10 barrel brewing system, something like that. So it's an interesting thing, and it's for me, it's a really great experience to find these people, to meet them, and then to sort of help them along in this process and try and not make it as difficult as it can be, because honestly, to do a commercial tenant fit out or a building fit out or architecture design project and get it constructed and worry about costs and worry about electricians and worry about permits and worry about inspections and worry about sprinklers if they're needed is a headache. So I like to try and sort of, I guess, calm the noise and just get them to focus on starting their business. And to me, that's why a lot of our brewers have been successful and are still open, and in many cases are opening second and third locations. So that's really good to see. That's kind of a rewarding aspect to this client type.
Couple like kind of rapid fire questions here. Give us an idea. We've talked sort of in broader terms, but give us an idea of some of the types of buildings you've reworked into breweries. Like what were they, and what have you done with them? So anything unique out there that people would find interesting?
Well, the first suspended brewery was in that transient church that was a theater at one point. And so that was an interesting one. The second brewery we did was for Diamondback Beer Company down in Locust Point area. And that was the old Phillips factory building. Used to be a 2-story building. And they had a canning process in there to can Phillips products, crab meat and such like that. Prior to Phillips being in that building, it was the Coca-Cola building. And Coca-Cola used it to bottle and distribute, I believe. So that building had an interesting history. The space, and I wound up, before I started my own firm, I was working on that building to do a 2-story addition at my old firm in town. And when that 2-story addition was done and complete and helped beautify that campus, they had this one space left over that they couldn't figure out what to do with. It was the smokestack going up through it. It was kind of the old engine of the building. They had the old boiler systems there. They had the mechanical pads. It was like totally covered in grease and soot. And then there was a sub basement below that that was kind of part of that space, but disconnected. They didn't know how to lease it out. And then the three guys that owned Diamondback came along and signed a lease for that space. They went to my old firm first, and then my old firm wasn't doing commercial projects. So the guy who had the lead on the project gave me a call and said, "Would you be interested?" And I was like desperate for my second brewery. I just wanted to do, once I did my first one, I wanted to do my second and third and fourth very quickly so that I could build that portfolio. So I met those guys. They were great guys. We figured that space out. Very cool projects. Really appreciated that outcome. So that brewery is actually in an old kind of engine room for a manufacturing facility. And they were really the only program that could make use of that sub basement, which is really amazing. I think they've since opened a county location. I'm not sure. I haven't been in touch with those guys too much, but so they've grown. I guess probably the most famous one of our breweries is Guilford Hall, which is in the old Crown Cork and Seal factory building, which has a very interesting history tied to alcohol in Baltimore. Crown Cork and Seal Company were the first ones to make the Crown bottle caps that all beer bottles use to this day. They started manufacturing them back in the late 1800s, and we're making like millions of them by the turn of the century. They started their manufacturing plant in that building, in that campus of buildings with the 5-story, I think it's now called the Copycat Building, the two Copycat buildings. One of them turned into the design school here in Baltimore. The other one I still think is artist lofts and apartments. And then Guilford Hall took up kind of the remainder of the campus. So that's a really cool building, really cool project that actually has a direct connection, I guess, to alcohol history here in Baltimore. So those are probably three big ones. There's others. I've done one in a high-rise building at the ground level that just had a leftover space. Yeah, I'm trying to think of others. I've done designs for modular breweries, like on wheels that could pull up and just sort of park. So those are interesting. Yeah, so there's a lot there in the history. I don't know.
That's awesome. I'm curious. Are there any, if for someone who's like not a architecture or design professional, if they're visiting a brewery, are there any references in a brewery that reference what they might have seen in like a historic brewery? I'm sure you've done some looks at like what the historic breweries looked like. Is there anything that's sort of like
tied to the type of beer that they want to make? So there is a difference in the tank you would use, lager tanks versus various other tanks. So the lager tanks are the ones that typically sit horizontally, and then your vertical tanks, which you see in most breweries, do kind of any beer. I think the people that have those horizontal tanks, and sometimes you'll see them in like a wood. I think those are people that are probably trying a little bit harder to connect to some historic aspect of brewing than the people that are just doing, the vertical metal tanks and making, 17 kinds of beers out of those same tanks. Like the one thing I've learned from a lot of the brewers I worked with is if you're going to do sours, you need a different kind of tank and setup than if you're going to do IPAs, because those sours, and it's I guess a lot of ways similar to cooking. Those sours will tend to sort of imbue flavors into the tanks and into the brewery system, and those flavors then will start to impact the other beers you make. So you really want sour beers to be made or in a specific tank system that's really not used for many other things if you're going to do it right.
Yeah. And then, as you said, like form follows function. So you've got to build the space to meet that.
Right. So Suspended, a really good friend of mine, Josie Schwartz, is a really good guy, great human being. He got out of Pigtown, had some trouble towards the end. I think he had a 5-year run down there. And, there was still a lot of weird things going on along the main street there that just didn't quite get cleaned up. I think the Main Street program there has been great. They were trying to get it to be a vital corridor again. I think they did a good pass at it, but he was still struggling to get the brewery into a revenue-making business. So he kind of backed out of his lease. He tried to buy the building, couldn't buy it from the owner, who didn't want to sell it. So he just backed out of the lease and went and looked for a building that he could own. He found that up here in Hamden, where I live, and bought a building at auction. And he is currently under construction. He's doing what I think will be, I'm not totally certain on this, but what I think will be the first net zero brewery in Baltimore City, at least, maybe in the state. He's putting a lot of effort into envelope construction on that rehab. It's basically just a row house that he's rehabbing, and then we're doing an addition on the back that'll house his brewery. I think he's going to have a heavy focus on sours and sort of Belgian style beer making, because that's his passion. He really has a passion for that style of beer. So I'm anxious to see when he gets open. He's kind of plodding along right now, but I'm anxious to see that. It'll be really exciting if that opens. So yeah, I think there's something to the tank styles, and just I think I know it when I see it. It's hard to sort of describe to everyone else, and I would hate for anyone to go into a brewery and sort of, hey, I heard on your podcast that you just have vertical tanks. Your beer sucks. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think there's great IPAs out there. I'm just not a fan of IPAs anymore.
Well, that was going to be one of my next rapid fire, which is David Lopez, designer of breweries. Do you drink beer, and which ones do you like?
Yeah, I've shifted from IPA. I came up when craft beers first started taking off. This is probably, I don't know, a history that maybe a lot of people know, maybe a lot of people don't. But the first one I remember was Pete's Wicked Ale. And Pete's Wicked Ale was around in the 1990s when I was just coming of age, legal to drink. I was living down Ocean City, Maryland, and I loved that beer. It was just absolutely the best thing I had ever tasted. And found one or two bars in Ocean City that served it, and I would hang out there whenever I wasn't working. So that was great. And then since then, the craft beer culture took a little while, but probably by the early 2000s, maybe 2005, you started to really see the industry blow up. And with that came a variety of flavors. And at the time, I guess I had graduated. Trying to think back on the timeline. I had moved out to the West Coast. I had friends who lived in San Diego. I sort of experienced Stone IPA for the first time, which was amazing beer. And then back here in Maryland, the Evo 3, Evolution Brewing Company's number 3, was a really good IPA. So I always felt, to me, that San Diego and Maryland had the best beers I had ever tasted. And I was a huge fan of IPAs, and those were my two favorite beers for a long time. And then I don't know, probably around 2015 or so, I started to grow out of the IPAs personally, and just shifted back towards lighter, easier drinking flavors. So now I'm kind of into lagers and pilsners, depending on the seasons. I will do some dark lagers, dark Czech lagers, things of that nature. I'm not a huge fan of sours, but if there's a really good one, I'll partake of it during a summer day. They're always good. So that's probably where I hang out most of the time.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it's kind of interesting to see the evolution there, probably along with the industry too. I'm curious, speaking of the evolution of the industry, I mean, like the elephant in the room with brewing and alcohol is that Americans appear to be drinking less, which is a weird trend. Does that relate back or inform the design? Are these becoming more multifunctional spaces in order to adapt to that?
Yeah, I think for sure. I think brewers who aren't considering the non-alcoholic trend are destined to fail right now. That's, I think, a certainty. But I also think there's still a room in the market. So when I grew up, the tavern at the corner of your neighborhood, that would be the place to go hang out and be social. Um, and you could get your standard Budweisers, Millers, Coors, those kind of beers there, and not much else. As the craft brewing industry took over, you started to see an influx of those beers at those corner taverns. Now we're seeing, at least in the past 10 to 12, 15 years, maybe, a lot of those corner bars can be corner breweries, like in a sense. You can almost have a small scale independent brewer take over a small space like that and develop a few choice flavors with a small brewing system and make it serve that function as the neighborhood tavern. So to me, that's
Interesting.
kind of what Suspended is looking at doing along Falls Road here in Hamden, where they're going to try and set something up like that. It'll basically just be a neighborhood bar. He just happens to brew all the beer on site. And I think that connects with the current consumer who values freshness over, in most cases, values freshness for their beer over, mass production and fitting in, I guess, with some of those large scale beer makers.
And it's easier, I think, probably from a profit standpoint, if you have less space and less things to try and fund, you can make a go of it, even if people aren't drinking
Yeah, and if it's
what they drank 20 years ago.
if it's a passion project, you don't mind wasting a day in a brewery making beer because you just love doing it, and you don't have to necessarily get paid for that day. You just kind of do it, and you're done. And then maybe a couple of weeks go by, you have a really nice flavor profile going. You put it on tap, and you sell a few pints. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense from a business perspective. I don't think it's something that you quit your job and do for a career necessarily on that scale. But I think there's still little room for that in our current climate. I will say that COVID changed a lot, and one of the things it did to our industry, it taught people that they could sit in their houses, to your point, all day, buy that 6-pack, and drink the day away. And then I think a lot of people got real tired of beer and alcohol consumption very quick during COVID because they didn't have a chance to go out and be social. And that lack of social interaction is kind of important to the industry. So people are still, we're 5 years, 6 years removed from COVID, and people are still learning to go back out and get back out there. I think what's really interesting, I read an article, or not the complete article, but at least glanced at the headline and a few of the passages about the World Cup and its role of potentially saving the alcohol industry in America. And I hadn't really put too much stock in that, but then I read an article yesterday that a bunch of bars up in Boston ran out of beer because of the Scottish fans are just drinking their way through that city. So, to me, it's still a cultural narrative. I think America during COVID maybe forgot that it had a love affair with alcohol and what it can do to sort of build social etiquette and social situations. Um, and I think we sort of need to rediscover that. I don't know, this next generation coming up seems to be the one that are spurning the use of alcohol and drinking of alcohol for non-alcoholic um, preferences. So I don't know if that'll ever change, but I still think there's plenty of need for it in our society, because people do enjoy celebrating with it. They do enjoy having a drink and having social engagement and social interaction, and having spaces to go visit where those two things can happen together. So that's what I like to preach. We'll see what happens. I don't know. It's a tough thing to read right now, as COVID has shaken everything up so much.
Well, I think that was like a perfect way to like end the meat of this conversation. We'll put links in the show notes so that people can find David and his collective and the firm and learn more about the work that he does. And if you're interested in getting involved in that, do you want to give sort of just a little background on the firm before we move to that last question? Just on like if people want to get in touch and where they can find you.
Yeah, we're Twopoint Studio. I think it's all one word, TWOPOINT. And you go to our websites, twopointstudio.com. We specialize in, we have a commercial studio and a housing studio, basically, are the two big buckets. We do a lot of low-income housing, socially supportive housing, elderly assisted housing. In Baltimore City, we really believe in this city and love this city. We have a love affair with this city. So we like to do what we can. So we work with a lot of non-for-profits, with housing initiatives and community engagement processes that produce, thriving neighborhoods. That's really the goal, to sort of rebuild Baltimore neighborhood by neighborhood, with our work, and the commercial studios and housing studios both play a role in that. So, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll put a link in the show notes so people can find your work and dig into some of these projects that you've mentioned today and maybe go and have a beer at one of them. Before we go, favorite historic place or site? It's an impossible question to answer, but it could be a place that you've been recently that you loved as well. What inspires you, David?
Oh, wow. Man, that one hit me. So a bunch of things come to mind. I really love going to abandoned buildings that the roof is caved in and there's like interesting light coming through, overgrowth of trees and stuff, and you're kind of just in this space and it just feels magical. But that's not what I'll say. I'll throw that out there, but I won't say that. I think probably to me, Italy comes to mind. Scotland, love Scotland. So those spaces and those historic churches and the older historic sort of mounds and things like that. I always find those to be interesting. But I think the space that probably was most inspiring to me was probably, the Parthenon, I guess, maybe. Or
it's hard to go wrong with the Parthenon. I don't think anybody could quibble with that one, so we'll go with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just an amazing design. I almost got kicked out of it for laying on the floor, so it was cool.
That's a great way to end the conversation. It's been a lot of fun talking with you and getting to pick the brain of somebody who has impacted some pretty cool places and some places to get together and places that make life better. So thanks so much, David. We've appreciated chatting with you.
Yeah, I really appreciate the time and really enjoy talking with you. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.